All right, let's get into our first talk. So, um, when covering the topic of discipleship, one of the things that um, we need to cover are definition of terms, and it really matters because if we define discipleship based on our cultural experience or practicality of church's definition, we might come to that differently. Um, and also, I want to make sure before we even get into the topic of discipleship 101, we talk about why we're here, because that is the main reason. But a couple questions I have for you guys. Why discipleship? Why Matthew? And why conference? All right, so why discipleship? For those who went to Kansas, we actually did some Bible study series talking about the definitions of biblical theology and systematic theology. And it really matters that we define those well because when we use terms, sometimes we mean different things by them. So, biblical theology is a theology that is of the Bible and its authors. No, it's not just theology from the Bible. All of your opinions and thoughts about who God is should be from the Bible, no matter how that's constructed. But when we say biblical theology, what we're talking about is letting the text kind of bring the spiritual agenda to the table. That we're saying, what is the author's intent from defining these things, and what is the text of the Holy Spirit speaking through it directly. Systematic theology is similar, but has its distinctions, particularly that it's a form of theology in which the aim is to arrange religious truths in a self-consistent whole. Now, to break that down, what systematic theology does is it tries to take different parts of the Bible when they use the same term and find where those terms overlap and where they're separate. So when we talk about things like the word discipleship, we recognize that different authors use the word differently. The semantic range of meaning is what we call that. And so it's important that when we approach the idea of discipleship, we define a main text or a main idea rather than a general vague sense of the term. Let me give you another example. That's a nice trunk you have there. What does that sentence mean? Right, I could be talking to an elephant, right? That's a nice trunk you have there. I could be talking about Charlton's behind, right? That's like, oh, no, wait, that's different. What else? What else could I be talking about? A tree trunk. That's a nice trunk you have there. Let me help you remove it, right? It's getting in all over the place in your yard. Trunk of storage, yes. Old Cadillac, yeah, right? There's a whole range of meaning that, we don't know what we're talking about unless we have context. And in the Bible, when we use words like discipleship, different authors might use it slightly differently. And one of the things we want to avoid is thinking that by getting all the definitions and combining them, that we somehow get a better definition. I think that does the text disservice. That I'd rather find how the author is using it in that context rather than trying to pretend I'm getting a 360 view of it, because in so doing, I think we actually dilute the author's intent of what we're talking about. So that brings me to my next point. Why Matthew Discipleship Conference? And no, this is not Matthew Henry. I actually was advertising to somebody about the conference, and they were a little confused about what we meant by that. No, it's not a person. We're talking about the Gospel of Matthew. The purposes of each gospel are really important when you're studying them. Again, people like to take, when texts talk about the same story, to get like the perfect, true, historical 360 view of it. But the problem is when you do that, again, you dilute what the author might be doing. Why did the author actually leave out some details? For instance, Peter walking on the water. Anyone know how many times that happens? How many gospels that we see that in? One. How many sermons walks on the water? They also talk about Peter walking on the water. A lot more, right? Because we think that it's like a really important detail to the story. But actually, if you study each gospel individually, there might be something that Mark had and didn't, and both of them leaving out Peter walking on water was important to that story. Maybe Matthew, because of his discipleship lane, is actually seeing a progression of Peter's faith growing in that moment, so it matters to that story. Whereas Mark is showing all these people who actually are scared and afraid. One of my favorite dissonances watching the biblical theology is when Jesus gets back into the boat, the storm settles. Mark says, and the disciples were confused and did not understand, for they didn't know how about the 12 loaves and the 2 fishes. It's like, or 5 loaves, 2 fishes. It's like, That's a really random thing for them to say, that they were confused about the miracle that just happened. Whereas John simply says, and they welcomed him into the boat glad. That's pretty different. And it would be a disservice for me to go, let me try to harmonize those things. So they welcomed him gladly, but they didn't, it actually, by resolve the tension, actually makes us miss the points. Whereas John is concerned about people accepting Jesus and believing, whereas Mark is concerned about something else. So let me briefly talk about those things. The thesis, or I would say the purpose statement of Mark, is right at the beginning. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That word beginning is actually really important. It's another semantic range of meaning. The beginning there is different from John 1:1. Anyone remember John 1:1? What beginning are we talking about there? Creation, the beginning of the world, versus the beginning of Jesus' ministry. There's the same word, right? But it's a different meaning. It's important that we catch that and don't try to harmonize those words somehow. And it's important that we catch that it's the beginning of his ministry. It's the end of it. And so throughout the gospel is actually moments of people seeing what Jesus is doing, and they're in awe and run away and they're afraid. For those who like to get to textual criticism, there's an ending of Mark that has nice happy ending, right? Where, Jesus is appearing to disciples. It's kind of a compilation of the other gospels. It's probably not an original autograph, and somebody later in time kind of took the other three gospels and combined them together. And they do that because they don't understand the purpose of the book. Because originally, the original autograph ends, the women of the tomb hear from the angel says Jesus rose from the dead, and it says they ran away and they were afraid and told no one. The end. Whoa, that's a little different than Matthew or John or Luke, right? Giving you attention because it's just the beginning of the story. It's actually moments where you see people are afraid, and then you're supposed to go, wait, I need to go tell somebody about this and not do what they're doing about that thing. It's actually a kind of invoking you to follow. That's Mark's purpose. And so that's why it matters that we catch the purpose. Versus Luke, he says while he's writing to you, most excellent Theophilus, though we don't know exactly who he is. We do know that he's heard these things, and it says, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. And what's important in Luke's account and his 2 in Acts is it's the most historically accurate, in my opinion, where it follows historical timelines of things that happen. So rather than the other gospels kind of lumping Jesus' ministry and different things together, he's the one who just goes in a pretty straightforward chronological order, rather than lumping theological things together. If you've ever read John, it's kind of a interesting mess of, he's just making theological claims and he's jumping in the story. He literally moves Jesus' uprooting of the temple to chapter 2. The thing that happens at the end of his life, right before he dies, he's moving to the beginning. Some people try to interpret that he did that twice. I would rather say that John's the one who's making more theological claims, and the purpose statement of Luke is actually showing, no, this is historically valid, and that as people or Christians are dying, here's why it's valid that their faith is from a Jewish root. And then John, well, he straight out tells you at the end of the book, these are written that you may know, and so knowing you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. He's actually omitted much of Jesus' ministry. 11 chapters are dedicated to the signs that Jesus does so that you would believe. He later talks about in the epistle of 1 John about how we're eyewitnesses. You didn't see Jesus' ministry. But here's how you can know and believe, because we saw it, so you can trust us because of our testimony that we have. And when he's saying these are written that you may know, he's like, wait, if we don't write them down, people might not remember these things, and we need to know that Jesus' miracles prove his identity, so we have to respond to that. He also has the longest upper room discourse, where he spends about 5 or 6 chapters just with his disciples at the Last Supper. If you've read Mark's account, it's 2 verses. Right? Highly different emphasis of what he's trying to say and imply. We also see that John and Matthew are the ones that use the word disciple the most, and there are reasons for that about what they're proving or trying to show. And so finally we get to Matthew. Finally we get to there we go. And what was that? Possibly, or it's just probably too much range. But we're testing it out with me before we get there. I might need to move my laptop next time. So with Matthew's gospel, we see, again, a purpose statement at the end. And part of how we know this is the purpose of the book is because he, again, leaves you on a little bit of a cliffhanger. After Jesus gives the Great Commission, the story ends. Most of the time when people write books, when they stop writing. And there's other historical things that we could see, like he, did ascend into heaven, but we don't actually see that in Matthew. The disciples go and tell stories, but we don't see that in Matthew. Also, it connects to the beginning of the book where we see an identity of Jesus, of the true Messiah, the king that's showing up. And so we take those two pieces and we say, Jesus is showing up as king, and he's getting people to fulfill his purposes of his kingdom. Now, however you eschatologically work that out, the idea is the disciples are the ones that are going to be fulfilling God's purpose on earth in the meantime. And so we take our definition from Matthew about discipleship. It's because he talks about go and make disciples as the main verb. So finally, before we get into the Discipleship 101 part of why I want to hit on is why we do a conference for this. Part of what Matthew highlights so well is, yes, there's a lot of teaching on the road that just as you're walking around from ministry to ministry, people follow, Jesus and learn from him. But he also has 5 major discourses in the book where he sits down and he just explains a whole lot of information. And part of why we have a conference versus a retreat, we've gone back and forth about those two words, is because we want you to have a lot of information so that you can go then figure out how that looks like practically in your ministries, that you can have those things. We also have an emphasis and a value of retreat. And you'll notice that if this was a normal conference, you would have a whole lot more options in classes, but we actually have large chunks of breaks. And that's intentional. We want you to be able to process the information while you're here. So listen to it, get the information during the sessions. During the break, what you need to do for your own self to process the information. If you want to process that by going into your room or taking a walk and praying about it and finding what that looks like in the Bible for yourself, do that. That'd be something that would help you meditate upon it and think about it, not just accept it from what other people are saying about it. If you need to go talk to somebody else in another ministry about that information or the speaker, we have lots of opportunities for the speakers to be here at camp with you. So you can ask them personal questions about how that looks like or confusion about what they were saying. So the breaks, use them intentionally for retreating, for being able to be refreshed. I know it's hard to be refreshed when you're jet lagged, when flying in, but as much as possible, try to take the information and not just accept it, but to process it while you're here, while you have this opportunity. Can I get the next one? Our mission statement, and you can see it in the program, it's to be a place that cultivates like a fire. I'll go ahead and just read it. It's on the last page on the inside. So the mission of Matthew Discipleship Conference is to encourage, refresh, and reignite passion among leaders in discipleship-minded ministries. Our hope is that you might have some struggles that are in your ministry or different things you're working out, that you feel encouraged afterwards and refreshed because of those retreat-like breaks. But also that the teachings and the things that you're talking about reignite a passion so that you go back into it stronger than before and with more vigor than you might have had before you come here. And our hope, and I should say our vision for that, is to connect discipleship-minded ministries and to help them thrive and multiply. Part of why I love having Patrick here and some other ministries is that I want you to get connected with other ministries that are discipleship-minded so that you have resources when things come up in your local context. I love having the conference move from place to place because we tend to get a lot of local people when we're doing these things so that you can hear from other perspectives that you might not have gotten before. But with that, as we've struggled with the idea of conference retreat, I think I just want to combine the idea. So welcome to Contreat 2022. All right, we don't know how to call it or what to name it, but I like Matthew Discipleship Conference, but if you want to call it a Contreat, I think that's pretty close. I like my word. All right, so as we get into Discipleship 101, transferring from the whole why are we here and those ideas and why discipleship, why Matthew, we have a short video that we're going to show you guys. This has nothing on the Bible Project, in my opinion.
Discipleship is a big deal in the Bible. In the Gospels, Jesus has disciples, and importantly, he tells them to go make disciples as well. But what is a disciple, and how are they made? In the Bible, the word disciple is used several different ways. In Luke's Gospel, anyone who listens to one of Jesus' sermons is generally called a disciple. The word in the Greek language that the Bible was written in means a learner, so maybe Luke was onto something. The book of Acts seems to use the term for anyone who believes in Jesus. Some have said the word disciple implies discipline, so it refers to people who take on disciplines or rules. But then the Apostle Paul doesn't seem to use the word at all, aside from one reference to Timothy. The majority of the uses of the word, though, are found in the Gospels of Matthew, 72 times, and John, 78 times, both of them speaking of the disciples twice as much as Mark or Luke. Matthew stands out. It's Matthew's Gospel, for instance, that contains the command to go and make disciples of all nations. And Matthew uses the word more narrowly than the other writers. This makes sense if he intends to link it to a specific command, whereas the others use the word in a general sense while relaying the story of Jesus in reference to their own subjects. Matthew makes discipleship the end of his story. When Jesus gives the discipleship command, Matthew wraps up his book. So in order to honor Jesus and his command in Matthew's Gospel, I'd like to suggest there is a Matthew model of discipleship taken not simply by word-searching the whole Bible for the word disciple, but by walking alongside Jesus in Matthew's account to see what it was he was referring to when he gave us the well-known discipleship commission. The best way for you to do this, of course, is to just read through Matthew's Gospel for yourself and note what Jesus does in the training of his disciples. What I think you'll find, if you do, is that the discipleship of Jesus is a robust process that gives particular shape and character to the kind of learners and learning methods he calls us to be and to embrace when he says of disciple making, teaching them to observe everything I have commanded you. So, when we talk of the Matthew Discipleship Conference or the Matthew Model of Discipleship, what we mean is simply discipleship as it's taught in the Bible, and specifically Jesus' example in the Gospel of Matthew. Alright, what is that model? What is the discipleship that Jesus commanded? Here's where I want to be careful. The parts of a thing are less than the whole. If you take a part and treat it like it is the whole, then you turn the part into something else entirely. Take Jesus himself as an example. We believe that Jesus was fully human. That's part of who he is. But if you say, so that's all he is, I believe in Jesus because I believe he was only human, well, you've taken the part as the whole, and now you're talking about Jesus in a way that wouldn't even make you a Christian. Christians believe that Jesus was fully human and fully God. You need both parts to get the biblical Jesus. In Jesus' example of discipleship, we note about 12 aspects of discipleship, roughly broken down into 4 categories: casting a discipleship vision, cultivating a disciple's character, creating a discipleship culture, and comparing to a discipleship standard. While you don't have to get every little bit perfect, if you're totally missing a part, you don't really end up with biblical discipleship. Let me give a couple examples. Under casting a discipleship vision, we note that disciples come by sacrificial commitment. And under cultivating a disciple's character, we say that discipleship isn't just about actions, but thinking and values. If you keep the thinking and values bit, but take away the commitment, you just end up with a free class. You get the crowds who follow Jesus on and off, but not the disciples that Matthew called us to observe and to be. Likewise, if you were to be big on commitment but only focus on actions, you'd end up with a superficial version of discipleship that would look more like the Pharisees that Jesus rebuked throughout Matthew's Gospel. Again, for the discipleship culture category, we see that Jesus did his discipling work as a family, and in the comparing to a discipleship standard section, we see that Jesus calls his disciples to faithfulness over results. If you were to have a committed group of people focusing on thoughts and values without being that sort of family environment, you wind up with counseling or maybe group therapy, but in a really risky way because you're asking people to share intimately without giving them a healthy place to do it. If you're all about results instead of faithfulness, that kind of sharing could end up being used against them or you as a leader. Each of these parts fit together and outline the shape of Jesus' discipleship. Ultimately, when we hold all of them in unison, we get a biblical picture of Jesus and a discipleship that should shape us like him. So here are the main parts we see in Matthew of Jesus' discipleship. Go read through Matthew's Gospel for yourself to learn more about each. A reading guide is included in the description for this video.
All right. So our heart and our focus here is talking about holistic discipleship. We're trying to make sure that the part doesn't replace the whole. Because often when you ask your churches or your church members, do you do discipleship? They'll obviously say yes, but what they mean by that can sometimes be they're talking about a part of it or a piece of it. And as much as possible, we want to be holistic disciple makers. So let's go ahead and start with a couple different points here. So holistic discipleship, we're going to start crafting a discipleship vision. I like using food analogies. I was going to add pictures, but I think all of you can imagine bread and butter, right? Can imagine that nice soft texture and adding butter to it. I like calling casting a discipleship vision the bread and butter of discipleship because it's so basic and it's something that has to happen at the beginning. All right, next. Cultivating a disciple's character, and we'll get to why I'm using those metaphors a little bit. Yeah, I call that the meat and potatoes of discipleship. It's some of the main stuff to, but don't replace it with the whole meal. All right, next. Creating a discipleship culture. That's your healthy greens, your salads, your vegetables, the things that make the rest of it possible. All right, next. And then finally, comparing to a discipleship standard. This is your dessert. And sometimes you get dessert, and sometimes it doesn't always look like you expected it to. All right, next slide. So we'll go through each one of those. Casting a discipleship vision. Part of why I call this the bread and butter is it's something that happens throughout the discipleship process, whether they are a person who hasn't accepted Christ or whether they are spiritually very mature in the faith. Upping commitment is something that happens a whole lot in Jesus' ministry. You'll see it at the beginning when he calls the disciples. You'll see it in the middle when he calls them to be more and more than they are now. And you'll see it still at the end when he tells them to go and follow the world. It's something that happens throughout the whole journey and should just be a part of our regular breath when we're calling people to be disciples. Our own hearts as well. If you want to be a disciple, you have to be committed to the call. It's double-sided sword of transactions, right? If I ask somebody to commit and I call them and they commit, we have a good relationship. But if I call people and they don't commit, we don't have discipleship. Or if they commit and I'm not actually making them better to be more than they are now, what have they committed to? There's no change. This is something that is small in a meal, but is critical for discipleship. All right, next slide. Cultivating disciples' character. This is your meat and potatoes. We'll go one more here. I like to separate this into two main ideas. So when you're talking about a disciple's character, one of the parts you're talking about the outworking of that idea. You're talking about practical ministry skills. And if you're a part of an official ministry, whether that's a mime ministry or a tech ministry at your church or whatever that looks like, you have to learn practical ministry skills in order to do the things that you're being called to do, right? If we want to do a mime ministry and I don't teach mime, I probably haven't made like that person a better minister using mime as a tool. So it has practical outworking. If you're not a part of an official ministry, this also might look like what it looks like to serve people, right? How do I serve people if I don't know them individually or thoughtfully? You're talking about how do I best use the practical resources in an outward way. But discipleship, as we heard, is not only concerned with outward things, but it's also concerned with inward heart. Um, if I get the outward training and I make the best mimes or I make the best public speakers or preachers, but their character is flawed, you just got a wolf in your church now who is empowered to do things that are going to ultimately hurt the ministry, that you need the heart of the character of the person just as much as you need the practical ministry skills. You need both. I would probably lean to saying the inward is probably more important, but if you have somebody whose inward character is good, but they have no skills or ability to serve, you probably need to do a little bit more work in the discipleship process of actually training them to do practical ministry. All right, next. What most people think of discipleship is probably somewhere around here. When you ask people to define discipleship, they might use the shorthand of a follower or a learner, but often they're leaning towards these types of ideas where they're saying, well, their character is good and they are good members of their church and how they serve. But that's not the whole of discipleship. So don't make this the main thing because there's a whole lot more to it. All right, next. One more. So creating a discipleship culture. This is your salad. This is something that not a whole lot of people like enjoying. When we went to Kansas, their meals were a lot more carbs with a side of carbs with carbs for dessert, right? But it's something that makes your body function. If you've ever tried to go too long without vegetables or green substances, you'll find that your body doesn't handle that as well and it starts like revolting against you and you don't sleep as well at night. If you feel like you have those symptoms, you might need more greens in your diet, okay? It's something that's critical because if you don't have the culture, but you have the rest of it, you end up having issues and conflicts on the inside. You have inside and outside threats. I like talking about this one as a greenhouse idea, where you are both protecting from outside threats, things that are going to hurt your ministry from the outside, and also protection of inward threats, making sure that the culture inside of the group is healthy, that you're all encouraging each other towards this mutual growth, that you don't have conflicts, divisions, or gossip among you. Part of being a discipler is confronting those types of issues, because if you try to have discipleship, but you also have certain types of sin infiltrate, you're going to end up with disunity and distrust, and people don't get to grow. It has to be a greenhouse effect where you are protected from outside threats that don't want you to grow and inside things that also don't want you to grow. And next, here you have access. This is one of the most critical parts and some of my favorite part of discipleship. When I did my internship with Tim back in 2013 and 2014, part of my favorite thing about it was I could just go ask him questions. And then he praised me for it. And I was like, wait, this is good. This is okay. Because as I saw him doing things, I had questions about what my own context looked like. And I had so much freedom to just ask him very vulnerable and open questions. And it reshaped my thinking in so many ways because I had that direct access to him. I like calling this your greenhouse axis. No, not gases, greenhouse access. I'm proud of that pun. Because without access to the discipler, if you have a distant relationship, you actually still missing a piece of discipleship because a lot is caught, not taught, that you're going to catch the character of a person, things that they have. Very, very large churches, and they ask you, and they name somebody like David Jeremiah or John MacArthur. Yeah, he's teaching you, but teaching is only a part of that discipleship process. And it might be better for you actually go to somebody who's not as good at expositing or teaching, because you actually can have access to that person. And that would be a better holistic discipleship than just getting, quote unquote, best teachers or best speakers that talk about the access, those ideas. And you're watching the hands-on ministry. Part of the challenge that we'll get a little bit later in the week is talking about how we don't just make disciples. But in order to make disciples, the first step is actually being a disciple. Because if you aren't a disciple, it'll be very apparent soon to the people that you're calling. Because if you call people to be more than they are now, but you're not actually challenging and being discipled to be more than you are now, you actually end up with a stoppage at you. That wherever you're at in your life, that's as far as they can get. And you can't take places that you aren't going. All right, last one. All right, comparing to a discipleship standard. This one's tough. This is one of those moments where we recognize the supernatural discipleship making, that it's not about us and our best techniques or our best efforts, but at the end of the day, the process isn't always producing visible results. And it's a bummer. We were to expect perfect results from being disciplers, then Jesus failed as a discipler, right? We'd all say that Judas probably didn't pass the mustard as far as our church membership classes at this point, right? Like, if Judas didn't make it and he was discipled by Jesus, we should recognize that perfection of all of the results isn't within our control, nor should it be. But rather, we should see that faithfulness is our measure of success. And we'll go to a long story, because we've talked about it in past conferences, and you can go back and watch those, I think. But when you measure your success by being faithful to the call, what you'll find is that you actually have better fruit and better results in your own heart. That if you're expecting people to change right away, and you're trying to do that as your fulfillment in ministry, you'll be very disappointed. It's like trying to expect all of your crops to grow in your greenhouse all the time. If your goal is 100%, you'll end up being disappointed. But if your goal is to do faithful ministry as God has called you to do, the measure of success is much easier to achieve, because it just is taking one faithful step at a time in your ministry. And as you do things imperfectly, you don't have to worry about this legalistic or perfection standard. You actually can just take one step at a time, following as God instructed you. When I became the director of this ministry around 2012, I recognized I didn't have a whole lot of what I needed. And slowly over the last 10 years, we've revamped many parts of our ministry as we figured out. And God has been super faithful, because I can't take any of the credit for the lackluster or the falling short standard of what I was doing in 2012, 2013. But what I was trying to do was be faithful, and I found God was working in my imperfections anyway. It actually gives him more credit when we follow in a faithful way. All right, next one. This conference, we're going to be talking about how this applies in different stages of discipleship, and how we apply some of these general overviews, those 4 ideas, into specific areas of people's lives. This is something that our visionary team kind of created and adapted. Let me explain a little bit as we do the talks why we chose these things. So let me go to the first one. What does it look like to disciple the unsaved? And you might think, first off, no, you can go to the next slide. That's perfect. You might think, wait a minute, discipleship doesn't start until they've actually made the commitment. Well, I would challenge you that when we use the word evangelism, we're talking about the same thing. When Jesus gave the Great Commission of going out into the world and make disciples, the other key ideas he talked there about were baptizing and teaching. And most of us would agree that when someone comes to the faith, they get baptized as entrance kind of into God's community that way. And so discipleship includes baptizing people. And if discipleship includes baptizing people, they probably can't have already made that commitment until that part. So evangelism is actually part of that process as we're bringing them in. Another part that I might want to highlight is in chapter 8 of Matthew. Some really interesting moments. We see crowds that Jesus is doing a whole bunch of ministry. It's kind of a moment where he's calling them all to follow him into a boat. And it uses the word crowd very specifically. You get a few people that give hey, I'll follow you after I go bear my father, or I'll follow you if, anywhere you go. And Jesus kind of gives that challenge. But in verse 23, it says, and the disciples got into the boat. Now, mind you, he called the crowds, and the disciples got into the boat. And at this point of the book, we haven't gotten to the 12 disciples. So we're probably talking about a generic group of followers. And so the difference there is if you were in the crowd and you got into the boat, you now became a disciple, as Matthew is developing that idea. So we see crowds, disciples get into the boat, and then at the end of that next miracle, because Jesus calms the storm, we see a very unique response where they say, who is this that the wind and seas obey him? Now tell me, if they were already saved, quote unquote, or if they had enough knowledge of what we would define as salvation, how could they not know who Jesus is? Sometimes being a disciple doesn't necessitate first accepting Christ. I've seen this practically in college ministries. We call them seekers often, where they come to our Bible studies and they're following all of the same steps that we'd call regular disciples, but they're very open about the fact that they're not a Christian yet. I think our definition of discipleship needs to include that, because if we just think of it as an extra step outside, that they have to get evangelized before being disciples, I think we're missing the principles that we can learn from discipleship of how we actually get those people into the boat. You also see, I'll skip it for now, a similar thing in Matthew chapter 4, 18 to 22. All right, next. So some examples of how we might apply the principles to that. First and foremost, the call and commitment are huge in this area. When Jesus does his ministry, he calls large crowds of people. And if they follow, they're in the first step of that discipleship phase. But I would also argue that the culture that you invite these non-Christians into needs to be thoughtfully done too. Though church, I would argue, is primarily for people who are following. If we include that idea of not Christians in that group, churches also need to be structured in a way where the gospel is regularly preached in a clear manner so that people take those next steps, even if they're not professing Christians yet. We need to create spaces for them to be invited into so that they can have time to have those access and those questions answered. You also can't change the heart of a person as they follow. Let them come as they are first. That Jesus calls people openly. Patrick will talk about the sower and the seed later, and I think it's a beautiful picture. If the goal was to try to throw the seed where it would be most effective, the sower would have put it just in good ground. But instead, the sower is throwing liberally to all the fields, whatever their heart condition were. All right, next. So we move on to discipleship of the newly converted. So this is the person who has now made a confession of faith. We'd say that they're spiritually born now. So where do you start? A lot of people talk about classes or Bible studies, or maybe send them to college or church membership classes. And there's a lot of theories, and I think those are beneficial tools, but let's not exchange what we're trying to do with discipleship. That maybe when we go to discipling them, we need to start where Jesus started. How did the disciples start following? Well, they just started following, right? They don't see the disciples talk a whole bunch in the book of Matthew until about chapter 9, 10. I'm trying to think. Most of what they do at the beginning is they just follow. So maybe when we have a newborn Christian, maybe they just follow you places, whether that's to your church or to your Bible studies. Those are great things. And classes, obviously, Jesus did teachings or long blocks of teaching. But maybe they just need to have access. A good book that talks about the idea of inviting people into the home is The Gospel Comes with a House Key, talking about the practicality of inviting people just into your. Maybe that's where you should start, just like I did. So I think I already gave the examples. Let's keep going for the sake of time. All right, discipling the immature. So this is where they've already gotten some core tenets of the faith, that they understand what they believe, they've confessed, but we're recognizing some immaturities in them. So what do we do now? Go to the next slide. Discipleship is not whole without inlet and outgive. What I mean by that is when I encourage people to go find churches, one of the main criteria I talk about is how do you both invest in the church, have a place that you can give to it, and a place that you can receive from it, the things that are going to help you. And in discipleship, I think that's one of the main parts of how a person becomes mature, is that they learn how to both receive the teachings and the ideas that are being taught from the discipler, but also they start learning practical ministry skills. Sometimes in an effort to make the gospel as clear and persuasive as possible, we save some of like the gospel calls, right? Or the call to the altar, or some of those big ministry things for the people who are most qualified. I would argue that's not Jesus's model. I don't know the time span that Matthew had, but he's called to be a disciple in Matthew chapter 9, and he goes out and does missionary work in chapter 10. I don't know how long that was as far as timeline, because Matthew's not as concerned, but I think the emphasis was still understood that sometimes ministry happens quickly and that they're doing it side by side in a messy, not perfect kind of way. And part of discipleship is Jesus going like, hey, good job, you got this. This needs to be worked on. And it's not always this like perfectionist mindset, but rather hands-on, messy process where I'm going to teach them, I'm going to work with them in all their failures. So some questions to think about, or some examples is, what ministry might the Lord be calling this person to in the future? Maybe it's following you in one ministry, or maybe you're starting to recognize the way that the Lord has gifted them and potential. I know I've never, for a long time, I didn't think of myself as a pastor or a preacher. I still don't in some ways, but it was about 5 years ago. I remember talking to an elder at my church, Steve Winton, who's done a lot of personal discipleship for me. And I think I remember having this revelation of like, I think I could be a pastor someday. And he goes, oh, I've always seen that in you. And it made me laugh, where the discipler had the vision for my life before I even realized it. And so maybe when we're discipling people, we start seeing like how might God be using this person in the future? And so this is where it's going to be a heavy time investment. I also think about Charlton doing an internship about 2 years ago. Internships are a lot of time commitment because the person's literally sacrificing 5 to 6 months of their life to be with me. And it was terrible. 1 star. Right? But part of it is I recognize that it was going to be a unique season where I'm going to do a whole lot more commitment to him in that time, because I know when he leaves, he's going to be right on the ground running with the ministry in Kansas, as well as the digital mime and other things, that it's going to take a lot of my time initially, but I see where God's using him, both strengths and weaknesses, and investing a lot of time in that. When you're discipling at this stage, it's going to ask a lot of you as a discipler, and you have to count the cost of how you're going to make this happen. All right, next. Discipling the plateauing, the spiritual teenagers. Man, teenagers are such a mixed bag. If you've ever done teenage ministry, it's like sometimes they like really get it, right? They're like on fire, they're like servants, but then they do something, you're like, where did that come from? Where did that talk come out of your mouth? Or where did that, like, how could you not see that was so obvious, right? So by this time, this is where, in my opinion, I see a lot of the church plateauing, where we get to a point of some level of maturity, right? We show up to church, we show up to Bible study, we periodically read our Bible, but this is where we start plateauing and where we stop challenging ourselves, where that call and commitment needs to be re-upped, that it's not just something that this is what a standard Christian does, but I'm not fulfilling a mature life right now, and it's just plateauing. We've seen this issue on our teams a lot, and it's something that I have to be actively mindful of, because just because this person is better than they were 2 years ago doesn't mean they're done growing. Very recently, Emily helped us do a lot of directing during our Kansas trip, and we debriefed afterwards, and she was a rock star. It was so awesome, the help that she provided. We still debriefed afterwards, and I remember talking to Jessica about, since she wasn't there, about the debrief, and she's like, aren't you being a little hard on her because she did so well? And it was one of those, yes, but like that's the cost of continually making sure somebody grows, is because we're starting to be more fine-tuned about what we're working on. Maybe at the beginning, when you have like a new member of your ministry or a new member of your church, you recognize there's problems here, but we're going to come to those later. There's bigger issues that we're going to work on. By the time you get to the plateauing, it's time to uproot some harder rocks and some bigger life character issues, and where it's going to be uncomfortable for you to call those things out in people, because it's something that's kind of been the norm, and you have to be willing to risk a relationship to call them out to be more than they are now. And like I said, teenagers, physically, a mixed bag. Imagine doing that with a spiritually plateaued teenager who's now in their 40s and 50s. It might be a little trickier. They've been comfortable in their Christianity, and maybe I'm not the right person for it. You might have to be tactful, but there's ways that we need to call people to not stop growing and to reproduce. Maybe this is a little bit too graphic, but sometimes Christians can get spiritually constipated, where we have a whole lot of inlet, but we don't have any outgive, and we don't have anything that we're doing, and we need to take a spiritual enema and actually get on with our life and do something. And it's heartbreaking for me to see the church just kind of bottleneck, where we all go to church and have a happy time. We're all spiritually getting our Jesus on, but the world's dying, and we're not actually getting out there and doing anything. All right, next one. So some examples. How do you need to encourage and challenge? How do you need to re-up that commitment? Confrontation and the creation of a safe place. If you've created that safe environment, challenging them becomes much easier. If the safe environment's not there, it's going to be much more difficult. And then this is also where actions and values need to be thought for. All right, next one. All right, now we move on to the spiritually reproducing. This is where we get to spiritual adults. And I know it's like an awkward metaphor, but get over it. Right? This is where it's time, you're a mature adult in the Lord, and it's time to like start just making disciples. Now, granted, I think part of the discipleship process is you learn how to make disciples along the way. That's why I have 13 and 14-year-olds leading as leaders, people who are younger than them in the faith. And it's not perfect, but I recognize that's part of the ministry skills that they're learning to do. But at some point in our spiritual lives, we need to be more active to go find people and call them. The person is now mature, not perfect, but what do they need to do? Well, they need to go make disciples. And now the disciple becomes the discipler. And your role in discipling them looks a whole lot like 2 Timothy 2:2, or the things that you've heard from me needs to be then taught to the faithful men to teach others also. And your role now looks almost like a spiritual coach, where this person needs to learn how to disciple. And so all the information that you've had of how to do disciple them, Now they're going to have a whole lot of aha moments like, oh, that's why you did that. Oh, I can do that for the person I'm discipling. And you're now creating that discipleship chain so that that person can be spiritually mature and thriving. So that as they become a spiritual elder, they're on their own and released and don't have to come back to you, and that they are able to multiply in such beautiful ways. All right, one more. It can be difficult letting people go in this step as you are working on discipling them, because part of what's going to happen is as you disciple them, they're going to start needing you less. You're going to start needing to meet with them less because, well, they need more time to meet with the people they're discipling. And this can be challenging in churches because part of, I think, why we bottleneck is nobody likes church multiplication. We have a whole lot of church splits, don't get me wrong, and those are bad. But church multiplications are really hard to do well because nobody likes doing it. I know our team, when we multiplied to 2 teams, but the value is multiplication. And if you never multiply, you just bottleneck and stop growing, and you're not actually being a faithful discipler. And so I don't know what those numbers are. I'm not saying a church of 100 is too big. I'm not trying to put numbers on it. You can still structure your churches to do that well, even at pretty large numbers. One thing I learned is that our team can do larger numbers because of the way we have other structures, that we can still have a team of 20 and do discipleship well if we add the appropriate structure to do it. But you just have to be intentional and recognizing that when you're at this point, it might have an emotional difficulty to let people go. One of the things that I've enjoyed about discipling Katie over the years is our relationship was very strong when she was on the team. She was with us for 8 years, and I loved working with her, especially by the end when I felt like we were like in sync with like ministry goals, how the administration worked, like what she was good at, what I was good at. And then watching her go off to ballet school. It wasn't just ballet school. It was something where she was ready to go be a disciple maker in other contexts. And it's been fun watching her and across the world. It's also hard because I don't get as much time with her anymore. It's actually one of those like sad moments because of the relationship we did have, but also a really joyful moment because I know that the kingdom is actually expanding without me having to do anything because it's already been done through Katie. Or the same Charlton. I miss you, brother. All right, next one. All right, so examples of applying these principles, thinking about release, and also recognizing that that's going to be difficult, but that's part of what the challenge here is even for you. All right, last one. All right, the long term, the spiritual elders. This is something where there's no retirement home for discipleship, that you don't just like get to a certain age, maturity, and then you're just done. This is something that's a lifelong process, and so at some point in the discipleship process, the person, there's an inherent authority structure when you're discipling something that you tend to have a lot more information when you're first teaching and discipling somebody. But at some point, the gap becomes smaller and they actually join you. There's no spiritual hierarchy at the top because not one of us is better. We're just recognizing that some people are more mature. We're trying to get them to be more like Christ. And at some point, there's no gap anymore and we're just brothers and sisters in Christ. It was a fun moment when Tim was discipling me a couple years later. I had a conversation with him where I felt like we were both talking about the same thing and we were sharing ideas mutually. And it wasn't just something where I was receiving, but it was something where I was actually able to give an insight for something that he didn't see. And similarly with Charlton, though, I did a lot of giving and outpouring to him and Katie. Now I talk to them as brothers and sisters on a mutual level, and I don't have the same relationship. So part of the idea when you start getting here and discipling people is recognizing that, as Jesus said to his disciples, I no longer call you servants, but friends. That even Jesus, as God, brought his disciples up to a peer level with him, brothers, that they were mature at that point, even though not perfect, and still things to learn, that there was a maturity of the disciples that they could call Jesus a brother, not just a teacher. All right. And some examples of applying the principles: a lifetime of faithfulness, no spiritual retirement homes, that whatever it looks like for you in your context or however old you get, to always be active in these things and mature people in Christ. So some final thoughts for you for this week. I know it was a rush of a whole talk, and we will go more thoroughly with some of those principles and those ideas throughout the week into different main sessions. So if you have more questions, feel free to keep asking them. I didn't expect to cover everything perfectly, but hopefully give you an overview. But some things to think about. Identify different holes in our discipleship. Maybe as you were listening to that, you were thinking, that's something that our ministry needs to work on and grow. How might that principle be better applied to these aspects? I know this last session we had certain accountability partners that we decided to do away with and kind of mold into our prayer group system because we were kind of doing the same job twice and it was more commitment than was necessary to do the same job. And so we kind of mended two things together to fulfill the similar purpose and make that more concise so that people can the commitment here. So maybe you have to think about how your ministries need to restructure, do different things. How are you not being a disciple? If you're personally disciple, maybe this is the week where you learn what that looks like for yourself and to find somebody to disciple you. I know it's not the norm, right? Jesus goes and finds people to disciple, but if you are somebody who needs more training or recognizing spiritual immaturity in your life, it's not, you're allowed to go ask people to like, hey, I have this problem, can you help me? Or I have this immaturity, or I want to be discipled and I don't know what I need. That's what I did a couple years ago when I took my internship. I was like, I don't know what I need, but I need something. In 2013, I took 2 weeks to go hang out with Tim, and I'm like, oh, there's a lot more here than I didn't realize. And that's why I took 9 weeks the next summer, because I need a lot more and then start working it out. How can you be more holistic in your discipleship? Why it applies to you and not just a church leader. We'll get into that topic later, just for the sake of time. One thing I also offer to you, Tim's done internships with drama in the past, and we've done one or two internships ourselves now. If you're interested in what that might look like for a more dedicated season in your life to go learn some of these principles in a mime team context or a church context, talk to us about what that might look like. All right, I wanted to leave a little bit of open time if you had any specific comments or questions. We are pretty much at time, so there'll be a Q&R session near the end that you can ask other questions, but for 5 minutes here, any final thoughts or comments or questions that you might have? Closer. All right. If you did, we have a microphone, but any other comments, questions, thoughts? Cool. All right. Let me pray for us then. If you have other questions that come up later, we'll have a, go ahead.
I was just thinking, since you're reviewing kind of the whole life cycle, the life cycles are ideal. We like to move that way.
Mm-hmm.
But none of us are perfect.
Mm-hmm.
I'll take my role on that one. So a lot of times I find myself wrestling at one phase because of something I screwed up in the earlier phase.
That's a good question.
What do you do when you're picking any of the phases and you realize what's bottlenecking you is stuff you messed up phases back? We've had this talk in our leadership circles, like, well, demoting them back to members is probably not a good thing. Because they're not horrible people, and really a lot of it we're going against our culture.
Right.
How do you work through the life cycles when you've got?
Yeah, so let me just reword the question for the audio, and then to make sure I got it right. What do you do when in a previous step of the life cycle, take any pick, there was a step that was either missed or dropped, and primarily on the discipler's fault of like, what do I do when there was a step skipped? The good news is God is faithful, so let's start there. That it wasn't dependent on me in the first place, and God can work those things out. It's also good that you're recognizing it at any stage, so being thankful that God is revealing that even at this moment. It also might be a lesson for making you better disciple in the future. So take those all as a grain of salt of like, you can use this for betterment. Now, as for the individual person, that's probably where you need to go back to creating that safe culture and creating that spot where you can actually talk to them about it. And you can even own it, saying like, hey, I know I have let this go, or I know that I have made this mistake, but I want to be clear that this is what I would want for you to more like Christ. So having that conversation with them in a safe environment, in a place that lets them receive that, hopefully will allow them to say like, oh, I see how that's beneficial or not. Or maybe they don't see it right away, and you challenge them to it anyway, even if they don't completely understand. You see that a lot in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus calls them to be more than they are now, and they don't get it. And that's totally fine. It's okay if they don't understand, but if they can trust you in those moments to say, I love you, and this is the issue that I'm seeing, let me help you through this part or this idea. Because sometimes you might get to a point of discipleship where you're like, oh, they believe like some heresy. Like, that's a problem, right? So how do we gently love them through it and think about how we handle that? And it's going to be so individualistic that it might be better that I'll have to think about it for the Q&R for what that might look like specifically. Yeah. Yeah, we can leave the life cycle up there. If you want to just go back a few slides to what had all of them, I appreciate that. All right, we're running on, so if you have more questions, we'll be around to ask each other those things. Let me pray for us, and then before I pray, actually, so we have a few-minute break. So the next sessions are the breakout sessions. Let's shoot to start about like 10:50. That'll be like a 10-minute break. Go to the bathroom, get water, all that. One session will be up here from Patrick, and then the other one down the hill in the lower lodge from Charlton. I need to go run down there and make sure things are set up. Then I'll come back up here to finish setting up over here. Tech crew. Any other questions on that? Cool. And then lunch. We'll ring the bell about 5 minutes beforehand to help people get up here. Lord, thank you for being so faithful to us. God, you didn't just send your son to die for us, but he set the example for what we're supposed to do and sacrificially gave of himself, his time, God, and even becoming a human for us. So I thank you for the example of Jesus. I pray that we would study your word to become more like him, that we would slowly become more and more like Christ. So when people see us, they understand who you are better. So help us to be disciples, help us to learn these principles and to gather these concepts so that we would be better, faithful disciples of you. Amen.